By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had reached a point where language itself seemed insufficient to describe its scale. Entire cities across Europe lay flattened into fields of rubble, their streets erased by years of bombing and artillery fire. In the Pacific, the war had become a relentless contest of endurance, fought island by island, cave by cave, often without surrender. Every advance demanded enormous sacrifice. Every victory carried a cost measured not only in numbers, but in the psychological exhaustion of nations that had been at war for nearly 6 years. Military planners in Washington studied reports arriving daily from the Pacific Theater. The recent battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa offered a grim preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might look like. Japanese resistance had proven fanatical, disciplined, and deeply rooted in a culture that equated surrender with dishonor. Civilian populations were increasingly mobilized, factories dispersed, defenses hardened. Intelligence estimates warned that an amphibious invasion could result in casualties on a scale never before seen in American history. The question was no longer whether victory was possible, but how many lives it would demand. At the same time, the United States possessed a new and terrifying advantage, one born not on the battlefield, but in laboratories and secret facilities scattered across the American desert and countryside. For years, scientists had worked in near-total secrecy on a project so vast, so expensive, and so radical that even many senior military officers were unaware of its true purpose. What had begun as a race driven by fear that Nazi Germany might unlock the power of the atom first, had evolved into something far greater. The weapon nearing completion was not simply another bomb. It represented an entirely new category of force, capable of unleashing energy on a scale previously associated only with stars. As President Truman assumed office following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, he inherited not only a global war, but a decision unlike any faced before in human history. The use of this weapon promised to end the conflict swiftly, potentially saving countless Allied lives, yet it also carried moral and political consequences that could not be fully predicted. No one truly understood how the world would react once the atom was unleashed, or how warfare itself would be transformed forever. Standing at the threshold of a new age, humanity was about to discover that victory, survival, and destruction could all arrive in a single blinding moment. Long before the first atomic bomb was assembled, a different kind of war had been unfolding in silence. It was a war of equations, raw materials, and theoretical fears, fought far from the front lines. In 1939, as Europe descended into conflict, a small group of physicists realized that recent discoveries in nuclear fission had opened the door to a weapon of unprecedented power. If controlled incorrectly or deliberately weaponized, the atom could release energy millions of times greater than conventional explosives. The danger was not abstract. There was a genuine fear that Nazi Germany, with its advanced scientific community, might reach this breakthrough first. This fear set into motion what would become the largest secret research project in human history. Under layers of classification and deception, the United States launched what was later known as the Manhattan Project. Entire towns were built from nothing, their names erased from maps. Tens of thousands of workers were recruited, most of them unaware of what they were actually helping to create. Scientists, engineers, and military officers were scattered across isolated facilities in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington State, all united by a single objective that could never be spoken aloud. At the heart of the project was a race against time and uncertainty. No one had ever built such a device before. Theoretical calculations suggested it might work, but they also carried terrifying unknowns. Some scientists privately worried about catastrophic consequences, including the remote but horrifying possibility that a nuclear reaction could ignite the atmosphere itself. Yet the urgency of war left little room for hesitation. Every delay raised the same haunting question. What if the enemy succeeded first? The ethical tension inside the project was constant. Many of the scientists involved were refugees from fascism, men who had fled persecution in Europe and now found themselves creating a weapon that could annihilate entire cities. They justified their work as a grim necessity, believing that ending the war quickly would ultimately save lives. Others were less certain. As progress accelerated, unease grew. The bomb was no longer theoretical. It was becoming real. By early 1945, the project was nearing completion. The weapon existed in pieces, scattered across laboratories and assembly lines, its true nature known to only a handful of people. While soldiers continued to fight and die across the Pacific, a decisive force was quietly taking shape, one that would not merely influence the outcome of the war, but permanently alter humanity's relationship with power, science, and destruction. The secret war inside the war was almost over, and its result would soon be revealed to the world. Inside the laboratories of the Manhattan Project, progress did not come in dramatic breakthroughs, but through relentless, grinding uncertainty. The scientists involved were attempting something no one in history had ever achieved: to control and weaponize nuclear fission with absolute precision. Every calculation mattered. Every assumption could mean success or catastrophic failure. Unlike conventional weapons, there was no prior battlefield experience to guide them. The bomb would either work as predicted, or it would fail in ways no one could fully anticipate. Two radically different designs emerged as the project advanced. One relied on a relatively straightforward concept, using a gun-type mechanism to force nuclear material together at high speed. The other was far more complex, requiring a perfectly timed implosion to compress a core uniformly from all sides. Even small imperfections in timing or geometry could render the weapon useless. Engineers pushed the limits of material science, electronics, and explosives, inventing new techniques simply to meet the demands of the design. The work was exhausting, and the margin for error was unforgiving. The atmosphere within the project was one of intense focus mixed with quiet dread. Many of the scientists understood that success would not simply be a professional achievement. It would mark a turning point for civilization. Conversations late at night often drifted beyond physics into philosophy and responsibility. Some questioned whether humanity was prepared to wield such power at all. Others argued that the knowledge itself could not be undone, and that refusing to act would only guarantee that someone else eventually would. As the war in Europe came to an end in May 1945, pressure on the project increased rather than diminished. Germany's defeat removed the original justification that had launched the effort, but it did not slow the momentum. Attention shifted entirely to Japan, where the war showed no sign of imminent conclusion. Military leaders demanded results. Political leaders demanded certainty. The scientists, caught between theory and consequence, could offer neither reassurance nor delay. By the early summer of 1945, the final components were ready. What remained was a single decisive question: would the bomb actually work? No simulation or calculation could provide a definitive answer. Only a real detonation would reveal the truth. The decision was made to conduct a full-scale test in the New Mexico desert. Humanity was about to perform an experiment unlike any before, one whose outcome would echo far beyond the war that had given birth to it. Before dawn on July 16, 1945, the New Mexico desert lay unnaturally still. A remote stretch of sand and scrub, chosen for its isolation, had been transformed into the stage for an experiment that no one fully understood. Scientists, military officers, and technicians waited tens of miles away, watching the dark horizon with a mixture of anticipation and fear. This was not merely a weapons test. It was the first time in history that humanity would attempt to unleash the power locked inside the atom. There were no guarantees. Some expected a brilliant flash and data to analyze. Others quietly feared outcomes that could not be reversed. As the countdown reached its final moments, tension became almost unbearable. Years of secret work, theoretical debates, and moral doubt were compressed into a few seconds. When the device detonated, the desert was instantly transformed. A blinding light brighter than the sun erupted across the landscape, turning night into day. The shockwave followed, slamming into observers moments later, rattling windows and chests alike. A towering column of fire and smoke rose into the sky, forming a shape no one had ever seen before. Even those who had predicted the blast were unprepared for its scale. Silence followed the explosion, broken only by stunned reactions. Some scientists cheered, others stood motionless, and a few were visibly shaken. The test had succeeded beyond expectations. The bomb worked. In that instant, a theoretical possibility became a demonstrated reality. The energy released was unlike anything produced by conventional weapons. Measurements confirmed that a single device had unleashed destructive power equivalent to thousands of tons of explosive force. The implications were immediate and terrifying. Several observers later recalled that their first emotion was not triumph, but dread. One scientist famously reflected on ancient words about becoming a destroyer of worlds, capturing a sentiment shared by many present. They understood that something irreversible had occurred. The knowledge could not be contained, and the weapon could not be unseen. Warfare had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. News of the successful test was quickly relayed to political leadership. The decision that had once been hypothetical was now unavoidable. The atomic bomb was no longer a concept or a threat. It was a functioning weapon. With it came a new reality: the ability to destroy a city in a single strike. As the sun rose over the desert that morning, the world entered the atomic age, though most of humanity would not realize it until weeks later. In the days following the successful test in the desert, the focus shifted rapidly from science to strategy. What had once been a distant possibility was now a concrete option placed before political and military leaders. The question was no longer whether the atomic bomb could be used, but whether it should be. For the first time in history, a single decision carried the potential to end a global war instantly, or to redefine the moral boundaries of warfare forever. There were no historical comparisons to rely on, no established doctrine to guide the choice. President Truman and his advisors faced immense pressure. The war against Japan continued with relentless intensity, and every week brought reports of mounting casualties. Conventional bombing campaigns had already devastated major cities, yet Japanese leadership showed no clear sign of surrender. Military planners warned that an invasion of the home islands would be unimaginably costly, not only for Allied forces, but for Japanese civilians as well. In this context, the atomic bomb was presented as a means to force a rapid conclusion, sparing lives that would otherwise be lost in a prolonged conflict. Behind closed doors, debates unfolded that mixed cold calculation with moral unease. Some advisors argued that demonstrating the bomb's power on an uninhabited area might compel surrender without mass civilian casualties. Others dismissed the idea, insisting that only a direct and undeniable shock would achieve the desired effect. There were also concerns about secrecy and credibility. If the weapon failed to intimidate, or if Japan dismissed the threat as propaganda, the opportunity might be lost. The bomb's value, they argued, lay in its sudden and overwhelming impact. Few voices questioned the broader implications. The war itself had already normalized destruction on an unprecedented scale, and the atomic bomb was viewed by many as a continuation rather than a departure. Cities had been burned before. Civilians had died in vast numbers. What made this weapon different was not the fact of destruction, but the speed and concentration with which it delivered it. In the logic of total war, that distinction often faded into the background. As preparations moved forward, the sense of inevitability grew. Orders were issued. Targets were selected based on strategic importance and the absence of prior large-scale bombing, ensuring that the bomb's effects would be unmistakable. The decision, once made, was carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. Yet, beneath the formal language of memoranda and briefings lay a deeper truth. Humanity was about to cross a line that could never be erased. The atomic bomb was no longer just the ultimate weapon. It was about to become a defining moment in human history. In early August 1945, the final phase of the atomic mission moved forward with a calm efficiency that contrasted sharply with the magnitude of what was about to occur. The selected target was a city that had, until then, largely escaped the devastation suffered by others. Hiroshima was a regional military and industrial center, a hub of transportation and logistics, but it was also a living city, home to hundreds of thousands of civilians going about their daily routines. Its relative preservation made it, in strategic terms, an ideal location to demonstrate the full, unambiguous power of the new weapon. On the morning of August 6th, the skies above Hiroshima were clear. Air raid sirens sounded briefly, then fell silent as the lone aircraft was judged to pose little threat. For the people below, it appeared to be just another routine alert in a war filled with false alarms. Few could have imagined that what followed would mark a dividing line in human history. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the atomic bomb detonated high above the city. The explosion defied all prior experience of warfare. A blinding flash engulfed the urban center, followed instantly by a massive shockwave that tore through buildings, bridges, and streets. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. In seconds, entire neighborhoods were erased. Fires ignited across the city, merging into a single, unstoppable inferno. Communication collapsed. Infrastructure vanished. A functioning city was transformed into a landscape of ruin almost instantly. For those who survived the initial blast, confusion reigned. Many had no understanding of what had happened. There were no familiar signs of a conventional attack, no fleets of bombers, no extended bombardment. Just one moment, and then silence, smoke, and devastation. Medical services were overwhelmed immediately. Hospitals were destroyed or incapacitated. Doctors and nurses, themselves injured, struggled to help tens of thousands of victims with little equipment and no precedent for the injuries they were witnessing. News of the attack spread rapidly, but comprehension lagged behind reality. Even within Allied leadership, the full implications of the bomb's effects were only gradually understood. This was not simply a more powerful explosive. It was something fundamentally different. The weapon's impact extended beyond physical destruction, introducing invisible dangers and long-term consequences that no one yet fully grasped. 3 days later, as Japan still hesitated, a second bomb was used on Nagasaki. Together, the two attacks sent a clear and terrifying message. This power could be repeated. The atomic bomb was no longer theoretical, experimental, or singular. It was now an operational weapon, and the age of limited destruction in warfare had come to an abrupt and irreversible end. In the days that followed the atomic attacks, the shock waves extended far beyond the ruined cities themselves. Across Japan, information arrived fragmented and often contradictory. Communications were disrupted, officials struggled to assess the scale of the destruction, and survivors' accounts seemed almost impossible to believe. Reports spoke of a single bomb destroying an entire city, of fires that burned without fuel, of injuries unlike anything doctors had ever treated. For many in the Japanese leadership, the claims sounded exaggerated, even implausible, until reconnaissance confirmed the reality. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not merely damaged. They had been fundamentally erased as functioning urban spaces. Within the highest levels of the Japanese government, debate intensified. Some military leaders insisted on continuing the war, arguing that surrender would mean national humiliation and the end of Japan's imperial identity. They believed that even catastrophic losses could be endured if it preserved honor and sovereignty. Others, however, recognized that the atomic bomb represented a decisive break from all previous assumptions about warfare. This was not a weapon that could be countered through sacrifice or resolve. It offered no battlefield on which courage or strategy could alter the outcome. Its power lay precisely in its inevitability. Emperor Hirohito was drawn directly into the decision-making process in a way unprecedented during the war. As reports became clearer, the implications were impossible to ignore. The atomic bomb threatened not only military defeat, but the complete annihilation of the nation itself. Continued resistance risked exposing Japan to repeated attacks that could destroy what remained of its population centers. The calculus of war had shifted entirely. Survival, rather than victory, became the central concern. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice broadcast for the first time. In carefully chosen words, he announced Japan's acceptance of surrender. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, acknowledging that continuing the war would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The language reflected both the shock of the weapon and the recognition that the world had entered a new and dangerous era. For the Allies, the surrender marked the end of the most devastating conflict in history. For humanity as a whole, it marked something more complex. The war had ended, but a new anxiety had begun. The atomic bomb had achieved its immediate objective, yet it left behind a lingering question that would define the decades to come. Now that such power existed, could it ever truly be controlled? As the immediate shock of surrender settled, a slower and more unsettling understanding began to emerge. The atomic bomb was often described in terms of yield, blast radius, and strategic effect, But behind those abstractions lay a human reality that could not be captured by statistics alone. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened to their cities, their families, and their own bodies. Many had lived through conventional air raids before, yet this experience felt fundamentally different. There was no clear moment when danger ended. The destruction did not fade once the fires burned out. Medical professionals faced conditions unlike anything in recorded history. Injuries appeared without obvious cause. People who seemed unharmed in the initial blast grew suddenly ill in the days and weeks that followed. Doctors lacked both the knowledge and the resources to explain what they were seeing. The concept of radiation sickness was barely understood, and its effects unfolded invisibly, creating fear and confusion among survivors and caregivers alike. Hospitals, already damaged or destroyed, were overwhelmed beyond capacity. The traditional tools of medicine proved tragically insufficient. For those who survived, the psychological toll was immense. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Familiar landmarks were gone. Social structures collapsed as families were separated, records destroyed, and communities erased. Survivors often spoke of a profound sense of isolation, as if they had witnessed something beyond human experience. The bomb had not merely killed, it had shattered the continuity of daily life, replacing it with an enduring uncertainty about health, safety, and the future. Outside Japan, much of the world initially focused on the bomb's role in ending the war. Headlines emphasized victory, relief, and the return of soldiers. The suffering within the cities remained distant and abstract to many observers. Censorship and limited access meant that detailed information about the long-term effects spread slowly. As reports gradually emerged, they challenged the earlier narrative of a clean, decisive weapon. The atomic bomb's impact was not confined to the moment of detonation. It lingered in bodies, landscapes, and memories. This growing awareness complicated the legacy of the weapon. It forced observers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The atomic bomb could not be understood solely as a military tool. It was also a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that defied existing moral frameworks. The war was over, but the consequences of how it ended were only beginning to unfold, shaping debates that would echo far beyond 1945. With the war's end, the atomic bomb did not fade into history as a singular event. Instead, it became the foundation of a new global order defined by fear, deterrence, and unprecedented tension. The United States emerged from the war as the sole nuclear power, possessing a weapon that instantly elevated its strategic position above all others. This monopoly, however, was understood to be temporary. Knowledge could not be contained indefinitely, and the principles behind the bomb were already known to scientists around the world. The question was no longer whether other nations would develop nuclear weapons, but when. Almost immediately, geopolitical calculations began to shift. Former allies viewed each other through a new lens of suspicion. The atomic bomb transformed diplomacy into a high-stakes contest where miscalculation could mean annihilation. Military planners no longer focused solely on troop movements or industrial capacity. Instead, they grappled with scenarios in which a single strike could determine the fate of entire nations. Traditional concepts of victory and defeat became increasingly irrelevant in a world where survival itself was no longer guaranteed. The Soviet Union, having suffered immense losses during the war, understood the implications clearly. Intelligence efforts intensified, scientific programs accelerated, and enormous resources were devoted to breaking the American monopoly. This race was not driven purely by ambition, but by fear of vulnerability. In a nuclear world, power was inseparable from security. To lack the bomb was to exist at the mercy of those who possessed it. The logic was brutal, but compelling. At the same time, the atomic bomb reshaped public consciousness. For the first time, ordinary people were forced to contemplate the possibility of instant, total destruction. Civil defense drills, emergency planning, and grim speculation about future wars entered everyday life. The bomb was no longer just a military asset. It was a psychological presence, looming over societies that had barely begun to recover from global conflict. The promise of peace carried an undercurrent of dread. This emerging balance of fear produced a fragile stability. The very power of nuclear weapons discouraged their use, as any conflict risked spiraling beyond control. Deterrence became the central doctrine of international relations. Peace was no longer maintained through trust or shared values, but through the mutual understanding that war could mean the end of civilization itself. The atomic bomb had ended one war decisively, but it ensured that future wars would be constrained by an entirely new set of rules. Humanity had gained a weapon capable of absolute destruction, and in doing so, had bound itself to a world where fear became a permanent companion to peace. As the immediate geopolitical consequences of the atomic bomb took shape, a deeper and more enduring debate began to unfold, one that transcended borders, ideologies, and military doctrines. The question was no longer solely about power or deterrence, but about responsibility. Had humanity crossed a line from which it could not return? For many scientists, intellectuals, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens, the atomic bomb forced a moral reckoning unlike any in history. Never before had a single human invention carried the capacity to destroy entire cities in an instant and threaten the survival of civilization itself. Some of the very scientists who had helped create the bomb became among its earliest critics. Having witnessed its destructive potential, they struggled with the realization that their work had fundamentally altered the relationship between knowledge and ethics. Scientific progress, once associated with enlightenment and human advancement, now appeared inseparable from the possibility of annihilation. Public statements, petitions, and appeals emerged, calling for international control of nuclear weapons and warning that unchecked development would lead inevitably to catastrophe. The creators of the bomb understood better than anyone that its power could not be uninvented. Governments, however, faced a different reality. In a world already divided by suspicion and emerging rivalry, moral restraint seemed fragile. Political leaders argued that abandoning or limiting nuclear weapons unilaterally would invite vulnerability. The bomb, they insisted, was a necessary deterrent in an unstable world. This tension between ethical responsibility and perceived security needs created a profound dilemma. To renounce the weapon was to risk weakness. To embrace it fully was to normalize the possibility of mass destruction. Public opinion reflected this divide. In some societies, the atomic bomb was viewed as a grim but necessary evil that had ended a brutal war. In others, it became a symbol of moral failure, evidence that technological power had outpaced human wisdom. Art, literature, and film began to explore themes of nuclear fear, apocalypse, and guilt, embedding the bomb deeply into cultural consciousness. The atomic age was not only a political or military era, it was a psychological one. International efforts to establish control over nuclear weapons emerged almost immediately, but they struggled against the realities of power politics. Proposals for shared oversight and disarmament collided with mistrust and strategic competition. Each side feared that transparency would become exploitation. As a result, the moral debate, though intense and widespread, rarely translated into decisive action. The atomic bomb thus existed in a state of contradiction. It was both condemned and relied upon, feared and defended. It forced humanity to confront a stark truth. The capacity for self-destruction now lay firmly within human hands. Whether that power would be restrained by conscience or merely delayed by caution remained an open question, one that would define the decades to come. The moral debate surrounding the atomic bomb did little to slow the momentum of history. By the late 1940s, it had become clear that nuclear weapons would not remain an American monopoly. The principles behind the bomb were now understood, and the strategic value it offered was too great for any major power to ignore. What followed was not a single act of imitation, but the beginning of a relentless competition, one driven by fear, prestige, and the logic of survival in an increasingly divided world. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device in 1949, ending the brief period in which nuclear power belonged to only one nation. This moment marked a decisive shift. The world had entered an era where multiple states possessed the means to destroy entire cities, and potentially one another, in a matter of hours. The reaction was immediate. Nuclear programs expanded, funding increased, and research accelerated at an unprecedented pace. Each successful test by one side was met by renewed urgency on the other. Technological escalation soon followed. Scientists and engineers worked to increase explosive yield, reduce weapon size, and improve delivery systems. Bombers were redesigned, missiles developed, and doctrines rewritten. The atomic bomb evolved rapidly from a singular wartime weapon into the centerpiece of national defense strategies. What had once been unthinkable began to feel routine within military planning circles. The unimaginable was now calculated, simulated, and prepared for. This arms race was fueled not by the desire to use nuclear weapons, but by the fear of being without them. Deterrence became the dominant logic. Each side believed that maintaining a credible nuclear arsenal would prevent attack by making the cost of war unacceptable. Yet this logic contained a dangerous paradox. Peace depended on constant readiness for annihilation. Stability rested on the assumption that rational actors would always act rationally, even in moments of extreme crisis. For civilians, the growing stockpiles of nuclear weapons created a persistent sense of unease. News of tests, ever more powerful explosions, and emerging delivery technologies filtered into public awareness. Maps of blast zones and casualty estimates appeared in newspapers and civil defense materials. The atomic bomb was no longer a distant wartime event. It was a present and ongoing threat shaping daily life. The arms race transformed the atomic bomb from an ultimate weapon into a permanent condition of global politics. It ensured that the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would not remain confined to the past, but would continue to influence decisions, fears, and strategies across generations. Humanity had not merely created a new weapon, it had locked itself into a future where restraint and catastrophe existed in constant tension. As nuclear arsenals expanded, the atomic bomb ceased to be an abstract strategic concept and became a constant presence in everyday life. Governments understood that survival in a nuclear age required not only weapons, but psychological preparation. Across multiple countries, civil defense programs were introduced to condition populations for a threat that could arrive without warning. Sirens, drills, public instructions, and emergency broadcasts became part of the social fabric. The message was subtle but clear. Nuclear war was no longer unimaginable. It was a scenario that had to be planned for. Children practiced evacuation drills in schools. Families were encouraged to prepare shelters and emergency supplies. Educational films explained, often with unsettling calm, how to respond to a nuclear explosion. These efforts were intended to reassure, yet they often had the opposite effect. The very act of preparation reinforced the awareness that annihilation was a real possibility. Fear became institutionalized, woven into routines meant to preserve order and stability. Cultural expression reflected this anxiety. Writers, filmmakers, and artists grappled with themes of apocalypse, survival, and moral collapse. Stories imagined worlds after nuclear war, stripped of familiar structures and values. The atomic bomb became a symbol of ultimate consequence, a reminder that technological power had outgrown humanity's ability to fully control it. Even in times of peace, the possibility of sudden destruction lingered beneath the surface of daily life. Politically, leaders were forced to navigate crises with unprecedented caution. Diplomatic confrontations carried a new weight, as miscalculation could trigger escalation beyond anyone's control. The presence of nuclear weapons altered decision-making at every level, encouraging restraint in some moments and brinkmanship in others. The margin for error narrowed dramatically. A single mistake, misunderstanding, or unauthorized action could unleash irreversible consequences. Yet paradoxically, this constant threat also reinforced the desire to avoid war. The shared awareness of what nuclear conflict would mean acted as a brake on direct confrontation between major powers. Peace was maintained not through trust, but through fear. Fear of mutual destruction. It was an uneasy equilibrium, dependent on communication, discipline, and the hope that reason would prevail even in moments of extreme tension. Living under the shadow of the atom reshaped humanity's understanding of security, progress, and vulnerability. The atomic bomb had become more than a weapon. It was a condition of modern existence, influencing behavior, culture, and politics across generations. The world had learned to live with the bomb, but it had not learned how to escape it. As the nuclear age matured, the growing awareness of its dangers sparked renewed efforts to impose limits on a force that seemed inherently uncontrollable. Diplomats, scientists, and political leaders began searching for mechanisms that could prevent catastrophe without dismantling the fragile balance that deterrence had created. The challenge was unprecedented. Never before had humanity attempted to regulate a weapon whose very existence relied on secrecy, mistrust, and the constant readiness to destroy. Early proposals focused on international oversight. Some envisioned a world in which nuclear energy would be placed under collective control, removing the incentive for individual nations to pursue independent arsenals. These ideas, however, quickly collided with geopolitical realities. Trust was scarce, and verification posed enormous technical and political challenges. Each side feared that transparency would expose vulnerabilities, while rivals might exploit loopholes or cheat undetected. The logic of deterrence resisted cooperation at every step. Despite these obstacles, limited progress was made. Treaties emerged that sought to curb the spread of nuclear weapons and restrict certain types of testing. These agreements represented cautious steps rather than sweeping solutions. They acknowledged the impossibility of complete disarmament in the near term, while attempting to slow escalation and reduce the risk of accidental war. Even so, compliance depended on mutual confidence, something perpetually undermined by rivalry and suspicion. Scientists played a complex role in these efforts. Many who had contributed to nuclear weapons programs became advocates for arms control, lending technical expertise to negotiations and verification systems. Their warnings carried weight, rooted in first-hand knowledge of the destructive potential they had helped unlock. Yet their influence was limited by political priorities that favored strength and deterrence over long-term restraint. Public pressure also shaped the conversation. As awareness of nuclear dangers spread, citizens demanded greater accountability from their leaders. Mass movements called for disarmament, transparency, and a redefinition of security that prioritized human survival over national dominance. These voices, though often sidelined, ensured that nuclear policy remained a subject of moral scrutiny rather than purely strategic calculation. Ultimately, attempts to control nuclear weapons revealed a central paradox of the atomic age. Humanity sought safety through regulation, yet relied on the perpetual threat of destruction to maintain peace. Each treaty reduced risk in one area while leaving the underlying danger intact. Control, it became clear, could only ever be partial. The atomic bomb remained a force that could be managed, delayed, and constrained, but never fully mastered. By the late 20th century, the atomic bomb had become woven into the fabric of global history, not as a single event, but as a permanent legacy. Generations had grown up knowing that their world existed under the constant possibility of instant destruction. Wars continued, ideologies rose and fell, empires collapsed, but always beneath the shadow of nuclear weapons. The bomb shaped what wars could be fought, how far conflicts could escalate, and where restraint would ultimately be imposed. Its influence was often invisible, yet profoundly decisive. Military strategy adapted around the bomb's presence. Large-scale wars between major powers became unthinkable, replaced by proxy conflicts and limited engagements designed to avoid nuclear escalation. Victory was no longer measured solely by territorial gain or battlefield success, but by the ability to manage risk. The atomic bomb did not end violence, but it altered its form, redirecting conflict into channels considered less likely to trigger catastrophe. In this sense, the weapon both constrained and prolonged global instability. At the same time, the bomb transformed humanity's understanding of power itself. For the first time, a single invention possessed the ability to erase centuries of civilization in moments. This reality forced a redefinition of responsibility. Leaders were no longer accountable only for their nations, but for the survival of humanity as a whole. Every nuclear decision carried implications far beyond borders, generations, and immediate political interests. Power had become inseparable from existential risk. The legacy of the atomic bomb was also deeply psychological. Fear became a quiet constant, shaping culture, education, and political discourse. Even in periods of relative calm, the knowledge of what could happen remained ever present. This awareness fostered both fatalism and caution. Some accepted nuclear weapons as an unavoidable reality of modern life. Others viewed them as a moral failure that defined the limits of human wisdom. Both perspectives reflected an underlying truth. The bomb had permanently altered how humanity viewed its own future. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy lay in choice. The atomic bomb did not force humanity toward destruction. It presented a condition under which every generation would have to decide how to live. Restraint, dialogue, and control became acts of survival rather than idealism. The weapon remained unused in war after 1945, not because it lacked power, but because its power was universally understood. The absence of detonation became, paradoxically, its greatest impact. The atomic bomb stood as a reminder that technological progress could no longer be separated from moral consequence. Humanity had proven capable of creating the ultimate weapon. Whether it would prove equally capable of living responsibly with that creation remained the defining question of the modern age. The atomic bomb closed the Second World War, but it opened a chapter of history that has never truly ended. Unlike previous weapons, it did not fade into obsolescence or become a relic of a specific conflict. Instead, it established a permanent threshold, one that humanity has stood upon ever since. Every generation born after 1945 inherited a world in which total destruction was no longer a theoretical possibility, but a standing condition of international life. The bomb transformed the future into something fragile, dependent not only on progress and cooperation, but on restraint and judgment. What made the atomic bomb unique was not merely its destructive capacity, but the clarity with which it exposed humanity's contradictions. The same scientific brilliance that unlocked the secrets of the atom also revealed how limited moral frameworks were when confronted with absolute power. Nations spoke of defense and security, yet relied on weapons capable of annihilating millions. Peace was preserved not through shared ideals, but through the constant awareness that war could mean the end of everything. Civilization survived by balancing on the edge of its own creation. Over time, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than historical events. They became warnings, silent, persistent reminders of what happens when technological capability outruns ethical consensus. Survivors' voices, scientific testimony, and historical reflection combined into a collective understanding that the bomb was not just a weapon of the past, but a responsibility of the present. Each moment without nuclear war became an act of restraint, deliberate or accidental, repeated across decades. The atomic bomb also redefined victory. Winning no longer meant defeating an enemy at any cost. It meant avoiding outcomes from which no recovery was possible. In this sense, survival replaced triumph as the highest objective. Humanity learned, painfully and incompletely, that some forms of power could not be used without negating the very purpose they were meant to serve. The ultimate weapon forced a reevaluation of what it meant to protect, to govern, and to endure. Standing at this threshold, humanity continues to face the same question posed in 1945. Possession of the atomic bomb proves what humans can build. Restraint proves what humans can choose. The future depends not on whether the weapon exists, it already does, but on whether wisdom can keep pace with knowledge. In the shadow of the atom, history did not end. It demanded something far more difficult: permanent responsibility.